Good evening. What happened in the last 48 hours has pushed the United States and Russia closer to direct confrontation than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. This isn't the usual diplomatic theater. This time, something fundamental has changed. And the proof isn't in what's being said publicly, it's in what's happening behind closed doors at the Pentagon, inside NATO command centers, and across European capitals now operating on emergency readiness we haven't seen in decades. Vladimir Putin issued a warning yesterday, not the conditional, carefully hedged language we're used to. This was declarative, direct. The message wasn't NATO must not do this. It was NATO has already crossed the line and Russia will respond. That shift in tense is everything. It signals that in Moscow's assessment, the moment for preventing escalation has passed. We've entered the phase where Russia is preparing responses, not issuing warnings. Within hours of Putin's statement being released, the NATO command network erupted into activity at a speed that reveals far more than any official statement ever could. Reconnaissance aircraft were scrambled across Europe. Strategic air bases capable of hosting nuclear-capable bombers went into heightened alert status. Poland reinforced its eastern border. Norway increased surveillance sweeps in the Arctic. Germany activated additional cyber defense protocols. You don't activate these systems unless the intelligence assessment is absolutely certain. The coordinated lockstep response across the entire alliance confirms one critical fact. NATO leadership interpreted Putin's message not as bluff, but as credible strategic signaling that escalation is now a genuine possibility. What triggered this crisis is Russia's perception of NATO's involvement in Ukraine. We're no longer talking about weapons shipments or training exercises. Moscow sees real-time intelligence sharing guiding Ukrainian strikes deep into Russian territory, target coordination enabling precision attacks, long-range missiles that the Kremlin views not as Ukrainian weapons, but as NATO firepower. From Russia's vantage point, every deep strike is a Western-sanctioned operation. The alliance has crossed from supporting Ukraine to directly participating in the war, and no great power in history has ever tolerated a rival dictating battlefield geometry along its own borders. This explains the dramatic shift in Putin's language. Inside the Kremlin, according to intelligence assessments that have leaked to Western agencies, hardliners no longer believe the West is simply trying to contain Russia. They believe the objective is to permanently weaken Russian power to the point where Moscow can never again challenge Western dominance. When a nuclear-armed state believes it's facing existential threat, the entire calculus changes. Escalation stops being a strategic option among many. It becomes a survival necessity. This is the mindset that terrifies Western planners because it undermines the fundamental logic of deterrence. Deterrence works when both sides rationally calculate costs versus benefits. But when one side believes its long-term survival is at stake, they become willing to accept catastrophic risks that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. Western intelligence agencies understand this psychological shift. That's why the response has been so immediate and so comprehensive. On the Russian side, military activity suggests the Kremlin is preparing for broader confrontation. Satellite reconnaissance has tracked missile brigades repositioning closer to Russia's western border. Naval assets have moved into more aggressive configurations. Strategic bomber squadrons received sudden activation orders. This isn't full mobilization. Russia is deploying strategic ambiguity as a weapon. By keeping intentions opaque, they weaponize uncertainty, forcing NATO to plan for a dozen scenarios simultaneously. That paralysis through uncertainty is exactly what Putin needs. If he can make NATO second guess every weapons shipment, every intelligence sharing protocol, every tactical decision, he slows the momentum that's been building through sustained Western support for Ukraine. From a realist perspective, what we're witnessing is the inevitable collision of incompatible strategic imperatives. Russia's absolute requirement is preventing Ukraine from becoming a forward NATO operating base. The alliance's core objective is blocking Russia from reestablishing hegemony over Eastern Europe. Washington is attempting the nearly impossible task of degrading Russian power without triggering direct military confrontation. These goals cannot coexist. They've created a geopolitical pressure cooker where ultimatums like Putin's aren't anomalies. They're the predictable result of structural forces that overwhelm diplomatic solutions. And history teaches a brutal lesson. When rhetoric escalates in both volume and specificity, the margin for error collapses. The slide toward catastrophic miscalculation accelerates exponentially. Putin's warning has sent shockwaves across Europe in ways that reveal deep fractures beneath the surface unity. For frontline states like Poland, Romania, and the Baltic nations, this isn't theoretical analysis. This is a direct threat that Moscow may expand pressure beyond Ukraine's borders. These countries are preparing for the full spectrum of hybrid warfare: cyber attacks, energy blackmail, manufactured refugee crises, direct military intimidation. Further west, the anxiety takes different form. Germany and France worry about economic consequences and political instability. But beneath these regional variations lies a universal nightmare haunting every European capital: the fear of entrapment. Being dragged into a superpower confrontation between Washington and Moscow that they never chose and cannot control. Europe finds itself in a strategic straitjacket. They cannot step back without appearing weak, which would only invite further Russian aggression. But they also cannot push forward without risking exactly the kind of direct confrontation their entire security architecture was designed to prevent. This explains the urgent internal coordination we've seen across the alliance. NATO had to present immediate unified response precisely because the bonds holding the alliance together are being tested at the most dangerous possible moment. In Washington, strategists have identified dual objectives behind Putin's ultimatum. First, freeze the flow of Western weapons and intelligence into Ukraine. Second, test American resolve at a moment when domestic political divisions make sustained foreign policy commitments uncertain. The trap is elegant and deadly. If the Kremlin detects even slight hesitation, they'll interpret it as weakness and push harder. But if they see unyielding determination backed by force, they may conclude NATO is preparing for direct confrontation, which could trigger preemptive Russian action. This is the brutal paradox at the heart of deterrence. Strength can provoke the war you're trying to prevent. Caution can be misread as surrender inviting aggression. The space between these outcomes is razor thin and getting narrower. Meanwhile, signals intelligence is flashing red across multiple channels. Agencies are detecting significant spikes in communication traffic at key Russian strategic command nodes. The pattern matches historical signatures when Moscow wants to broadcast combat readiness without explicitly declaring it. The intelligence community is working around the clock to answer one critical question: is this sophisticated coercive diplomacy, or is it genuine preparation for kinetic operations? While the public watches sanitized press conferences, both superpowers are quietly removing safety locks from systems they hope never to use again. This is how catastrophe actually unfolds, not with dramatic declarations or sudden explosions, but with incremental mechanical steps, readiness levels increasing one notch at a time, each side convinced they're being defensive while the other sees preparation for attack. For Ukraine, Putin's threats are interpreted as validation, proof that their strategy is working, that deep strikes are causing real damage, that Western support is having strategic impact. But behind the confidence lies cold calculation. Kiev understands that a cornered Russia is an unpredictable Russia. They face an agonizing calibration: how to maintain momentum and capitalize on current advantages without crossing an invisible threshold that triggers Russian escalation so severe it resets the entire conflict. Europe is confronting a stark new reality. The shadow of great power conflict has returned to the continent. The Russia we're dealing with today isn't the pragmatic partner of the early 2000s. This is a Russia convinced it's fighting for survival as a great power, its place in history, its very existence as an independent actor on the global stage. When nuclear powers view conflicts through an existential lens, their risk tolerance skyrockets. That fundamental shift undermines NATO's entire security architecture, which was built on assumptions of rational, predictable adversaries making careful cost benefit calculations. Putin just shattered that assumption at exactly the moment Europe can least afford it. The true tragedy here is the security dilemma in its purest form. Every actor is convinced they're defending themselves. Moscow sees NATO encirclement, Brussels sees Russian revisionism, Washington sees itself preventing aggression. Each side views its own military deployments as stabilizing and the other side's as provocative. This symmetry of fear is the most volatile dynamic in international politics. It forces escalation not from aggression, but from terror. Nations climb the ladder because they're convinced standing still means strategic death. Putin's warning was the signal. NATO's response was the confirmation. And the frantic reassessment happening inside Western capitals reveals how thin the ice has become. The temperature isn't dropping, the vice is tightening. We're at a tipping point where the next move from either side won't just determine the outcome in Ukraine. It will define European stability and global security architecture for the next generation. What we're witnessing isn't just military maneuvering, it's the breakdown of the fundamental language that allows great powers to manage conflicts without destroying each other. The clock is ticking, and nobody knows how much time we have left before one side makes a move the other interprets as the point of no return.